A-W-E. And I'll say, after I read the very first piece, I'll say a little bit about what I mean by awe, my understanding of that. So these are just a few excerpts from a long book. It's always hard to figure out how to read from a long book to give listeners a taste for what the overall book does. There are different threads that I could follow. And the selections I pulled out have two interwoven threads. One is parents and children, beginning with my father and mother and myself, and then ending up with myself as a father. And the other has to do with the formation of my own attitudes towards violence, military violence and other kinds of violence. So here's the opening. I was born in Memphis 2 months after the end of the Second World War, 2 months after the nuclear bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And I was born in Memphis and then spent my early years on a farm outside of Memphis. And what you're going to hear is my first vivid, elaborate memory. You'll hear my father say a couple of words. He was from Mississippi, so you'll hear me doing a bad imitation of a good Mississippi accent. And my mother was from Chicago, and I'm not even going to try to imitate Chicago. When my father wrapped me in his arms and carried me onto the screened porch of our farmhouse in Tennessee during a thunderstorm, he said nothing about the booming and blowing, merely hummed a tune, a sound I confused with the purr of the rain. It was as though he had swallowed a bit of thunder, which now rumbled in his throat. Mama thrust her head from the doorway and said, "You'll catch a chill." "We're doing just fine," Dad said. Mama paused skeptically, for she believed that disaster could strike at any moment, from any direction. She frowned as if doubting she would ever see us again among the living, and then she withdrew inside. Dad tucked me closer and pulled his baggy hunting jacket around me. I shivered against him, less from cold than from excitement. Rain drummed down on the tin roof of the porch, rattled in the downspouts, hissed on the new grass with the sound of bacon frying in a pan. Wind hurled twigs and last year's leaves across the yard. This year's leaves, no bigger than the paws on a kitten, were just breaking out on the trees, so it must have been early spring, most likely March. In October, I would turn 5. I had climbed the smaller trees, pecan and persimmon, sweet gum and tupelo, but the huge oak out by the blacktop road I could only gaze at and wonder, for its lowest branches loomed far beyond my reach. It was the tallest thing I knew, taller than the barn, taller than the windmill in the pasture, taller than the spire on our church. I was watching that oak sway in the storm, its fat limbs thrashing as if it were a sapling, when suddenly a flash and boom split the air. I lurched in my father's arms, and he jumped too, but held me tight. My ears rang. Bumps rose on my skin. I felt a heart pounding, whether Dad's or mine, I couldn't tell. He broke off humming to whistle. "Sweet Jesus, will you look at that?" I blinked, but could see only a white glare. I touched my eyes to make sure they were still in place. Gradually, shapes thickened in the brightness, and I could make out the porch railing, the gravel path stretching away into the yard, the flower bed with petunias bobbing their bedraggled pink heads in the rain. And out by the road, the great oak snapped like a stick, its top shattered on the ground, a charred streak running down the wet gray stub of the trunk. "What happened, Daddy?" I asked. "Lightning hit the old guy." "Will he die?" "He's done for, buddy. I'll have to cut him up." His voice shook in a way I had never heard before. I asked no more questions, but only snuggled against his chest, craving his warmth and weight. Soon he began humming again, and I could hear the rain pattering more quietly on the porch roof, and thunder grumbling farther and farther away. And I could watch lightning flicker beyond cotton fields at the edge of the world. And I could see the oak scattered across the yard in scraps of bark, broken limbs, and shards of wood the color of bread. One moment the great tree had stood there by the road as solid as my father, bigger than anything else I knew, and the next moment it was gone. That erasure haunts me still. Over half a century later, long after our Tennessee farm vanished under a subdivision and my father died, I still ring with the astonishment I felt that day when the sky cracked open to reveal a world where even grown-ups were tiny and houses were toys, and wood and skin and everything was made of light. Well, you can see why that would linger in a child's memory, or in my case, a 63-year-old man's memory. And what was combined in that experience was the extremes, on the one hand, of security, intimacy, protection in my father, and on the other hand, the witness of this vast power, this enormous power that was beyond anything I could imagine, that even scared my father. And awe, the word that's in the title of this book, awe combines two emotions, wonder and dread, or amazement and fear. And the more I thought about that combination, the more I came to feel that it is the single most distinctive and true feeling for our existence. Because we are tiny creatures and brief-lived creatures in a vast universe filled with powers that exceed our capacities by an enormous scale. So that combination of feeling wonder and amazement at the fact that we're here, the fact that in our case we can talk, we can walk, we can sing, but also we're in this place that is so much older, so much more powerful, so much more enormous than we are. That combination of wonder and dread, or amazement and terror, seems to me a touchstone for human experience. So I thought back through my life, and I identified a number of moments in my life that evoked that emotion. And they weren't all dark, some were glorious. But they evoked that emotion, that very complicated, powerful emotion. And it's an emotion that I'm convinced everybody feels. But maybe not everybody takes time to think about it, or has a name for it, or has the privilege of reflecting back on it as a writer does. The next passage, I'm just going to warn you, there's some gore at the end of this passage. It's not